As over 2 million American soldiers boarded the transport ships bound for France, more than 1 million American women sustained the wartime labor force. A great many jobs, which had previously been considered man's work, were being filled by women. In the factory, the shipyard, and the armed forces. Women plowed the fields, fixed the cars, delivered the mail, ran the elevators and the streetcars, and even wrote the traffic tickets. President Wilson encouraged employers to pay female workers the same wages they had paid men, but few did. Even worse, when the war was over and men returned to the workforce, a great many women were fired. Other women contributed to the war effort by volunteering. They served in the Red Cross, sold Liberty bonds, and planted victory gardens. Others, like Jane Addams and Carrie Chapman Catt, raised public awareness by actively demonstrating against war and militarism. As the war dragged on, the nation began to appreciate the valuable contribution made by women in the war effort, creating a prime opportunity for a change in women's civil liberties. On January 10, 1917, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns of the National Women's Party took action. For almost a year, they paraded and picketed the White House, demanding passage of a constitutional amendment granting women's suffrage, the right to vote. Wilson was out of office by the time the 19th Amendment was ratified, but there was no doubt that the new role of women in America during World War I was a catalyst leading to the right to vote. Society also had to come to grips with a new role for African Americans. Like most Americans, African Americans were divided in their opinions about the war. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote an editorial in The Crisis, a newspaper published by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, urging African Americans to support the war effort.
Let us, while the crisis lasts, forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our own white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy.
William Monroe Trotter, editor of the Boston Guardian newspaper, disagreed. He felt African Americans were victims of racism and should not support a racist government. At home, the war contributed to the large-scale migration of more than 500,000 African Americans into the industrialized cities of the North. They provided the workforce desperately needed to produce wartime goods. In addition, immigration into America had slowed to a trickle, and many immigrants had returned to their native homelands, leaving more jobs to be filled. Despite the many women employed, companies were still short of workers. Many African Americans were anxious to leave the South and its pattern of racial discrimination, low pay, and all too often, life-threatening conditions. Between 1892 and 1919, approximately 3,000 African Americans were killed by lynching, mainly in the South. When Northern manufacturing companies sent recruiting agents with free railroad tickets into the South looking for laborers, hundreds of thousands of men and women boarded trains and headed for cities like Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. The Chicago Defender, the most widely read African American newspaper in the South, urged Southern African Americans to come north. Some even wrote the newspaper for advice.
Dear Sir, I have a wife and one child and can hardly feed them. I thought to write and ask you for some information concerning how to get a pass for myself and family. Please don't publish this because we have to whisper this around among ourselves, because the white folks are angry now because the Negroes are going north.
Able-bodied men and women came and found work in places like Henry Ford's assembly lines, where they could make as much as $5 a day, far exceeding anything African Americans could earn in the South. Despite the opportunities in the North, Black Americans found some new and some familiar problems in the North. Many blacks were forced to live in crowded, segregated housing, contributing to the rise of urban black ghettos, and they paid ridiculously high rents for the dubious privilege. African Americans were frequently denied membership in labor unions by white workers. Therefore, they were left few choices other than to accept unpopular positions as scabs or replacement workers employed during strikes. This labor struggle bred resentment among white laborers, their feelings fueled by ignorant racist opinions. Instead of competing with whites, some African Americans became entrepreneurs within the black community itself. They opened stores and insurance agencies, or offered personal services like undertaking and hairdressing. Other African American men and women, allowed few options, worked as domestic servants. In the North, a cook or a laundress earned as much money in a day as she made in a week back south. Domestic servants could earn twice as much in a northern home as a southern home. But northern homes tended to be smaller and more modern, so fewer African Americans were being hired for full-time work. Regardless, jobs, even at the lowest factory pay scale, could earn African Americans $3 a day compared to 50 cents a day in the rural South. But soon, the competition and racial tension between white and black workers led to race riots in dozens of northern cities. In July of 1917, white workers, incensed by the hiring of blacks as strikebreakers at an East St. Louis, Illinois munitions plant, ran through the streets, mindlessly stalking and killing blacks. 49 African Americans and 9 white Americans died. The New York Age reported on the march.
They marched without uttering one word or making a single gesticulation and protested in respectful silence against the reign of mob law, segregation, Jim Crowism, and many other indignities to which race is unnecessarily subjected in the United States.
Just 2 years later, a 17-year-old swam from the black beach to the white beach on the shores of Lake Michigan in Chicago. Whites threw rocks at him until he drowned. Provoked by the whites' barbaric action, blacks revolted. News of the fight reached several neighborhoods, and within hours, fighting broke out there, too. For 3 days and nights, the riot went unchecked until Illinois state troopers finally restored peace. 38 people lost their lives, 23 African American and 15 white, with another 520 citizens injured. James Weldon Johnson, diplomat, poet, novelist, critic, and composer, said the summer of 1919 was the red summer of hate for the bloodshed in racial violence. White America was learning what black Americans had known all along. Racial prejudice wasn't a problem confined to the South. It was an American problem. And African Americans weren't the only ones whose civil liberties were being abused. Once war was declared, conformity, patriotism, and complete support for the war were demanded of all Americans. Freedom of speech and thought was becoming unacceptable. Different language and culture, suspicious. German Americans in particular were scrutinized and their loyalty questioned. Schools dropped German from their language classes. German books were withdrawn from public libraries. German measles was renamed Liberty measles, and sauerkraut, Liberty cabbage. Frederick Stock, the distinguished conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, was not allowed to conduct, and many other orchestras refused to play the music of Bach and Beethoven. Soon, these sentiments manifested into anti-German violence. The most notorious case occurred in Collinsville, Illinois, when German-born Robert Prager was lynched. Intolerance spread beyond German Americans. William Harding, then governor of Iowa, made a brash proclamation.
Conversation in public places, on trains, or over the telephone should be in the English language.
People who spoke Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and Czech, on top of those who spoke German, were affected. Elderly women were jailed for speaking German over the telephone. A Lutheran pastor was imprisoned for preaching part of a funeral service for a soldier killed in the war in Swedish. His explanation that he did it because the young man's grandparents couldn't speak English did not sway the judge. Governor Harding even maintained that God did not hear prayers that were spoken in any language other than English. In June of 1917, Congress passed and President Wilson signed the Espionage Act, and 11 months later, the Sedition Act. Under these laws, a person could be fined as much as $10,000 and could be sentenced to as many as 20 years in prison for anti-war activities, like interfering with the draft or with the sale of government bonds. Imprisonment could result from saying anything disloyal, profane, or abusive concerning the war effort. Despite the fact that these two acts violated the First Amendment to the Constitution, the right of free speech, the Supreme Court upheld their constitutionality, claiming that there was a clear and present danger to free speech and a free press during a war. The result was that citizens were harassed purely upon suspicion. Walter Matthey was jailed for the high crime of attending an anti-war meeting and contributing a quarter to the cause. Under the act, the post office could censor the mail, and over 400 periodicals were banned for a time, including the Saturday Evening Post and the New York Times. Robert Goldstein ran afoul of the law with his film, The Spirit of '76. It was just a silent movie about the Revolutionary War, and of course the British were portrayed as America's enemy. Now, however, America and Great Britain were allies, and Goldstein was told to remove scenes of British soldiers shooting colonists. He refused and was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Goldstein served 3 years, and his career never recovered. But the worst treatment under the Espionage and Sedition Acts was reserved for socialists and labor leaders. The founder of the Socialist Party and frequent presidential candidate, Eugene V. Debs, was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment on each of 3 counts to be served concurrently for his outspoken opposition to the war.
I have been accused of obstructing the war, I admit it. Gentlemen, I abhor war.
Undaunted, Debs ran for president from his jail cell in the Atlanta prison in 1920 and got almost 1 million votes. In 1921, President Warren Harding commuted his sentence. Emma Goldman, an anarchist, a person who believes there should be no government, was fined $10,000 and given 2 years in jail for denouncing the draft. On her release, she was promptly deported to Russia. Labor organizer Big Bill Haywood was convicted of sabotaging the war effort because he encouraged workers to strike for fair pay and decent working conditions. Haywood received a sentence of 20 years for his troubles, but jumped bail and fled to Russia, where he remained until his death 10 years later. On President Wilson's last day in office, Congress repealed the Sedition Act. Ironically, while American soldiers fought for freedom in Europe, freedom of speech and civil liberties were being denied to Americans at home.